Greetings and welcome to the pre-concert video for the final concert of our virtual season. I'm Bob Fraser, your host. This concert goes out on June the 24th at 7:30 p.m. and features Felix Mendelssohn's famous Violin Concerto in E minor and the Overture in E flat major of the French composer Louise Farrenc. Now this latter work is another Victoria Symphony premiere. You'll remember on my last talk about Telemann and Emanuel Bach, I mentioned there's an ocean of repertoire out there from all eras of music that we have yet to bring to you, and this is one of those pieces. You'll also remember we started this season with Terry Tam, our concertmaster, leading the orchestra in Vivaldi's famous set of violin concertos known as the Four Seasons. So it's nice to have Terry as the bookend to the season as soloist, and in this case he's performing one of the most performed concerti in the repertoire, the Mendelssohn. Now I have to point out that even with a shortened season, we maybe did 20 some odd programs this year. We normally do more than 40 unique programs in a season, including what we do for the opera. Considering we haven't been able to bring in soloists from outside of Victoria, and Angela Hewitt was the only exception, we've had a really good tour this season through what I would call the development of the concerto. So from the Baroque era with Vivaldi and Angela Hewitt's interpretation of J.S. Bach's famous D minor keyboard concerto through Emanuel Bach's cello concerto, Joseph Bologne's exquisite mastery of the Sinfonia Concertante, two of Mozart's horn concerti, and his exquisite 21st Piano Concerto, which are all loving tributes to his mastery of the operatic art form, the Beethoven Triple Concerto, a very modern tip of the hat to the Baroque era from Francis Poulenc with his organ concerto, and even a concerto that we commissioned, the trumpet concerto of our composer-in-residence Marcus Goddard. So there's that whole grand tour of the concerto in one compact season. I think it's a real testament to the talent that exists in our community and in its orchestra that we can put together a pretty diverse program like this. Now, it's always a bit of a challenge for me to talk to you about a work like the Mendelssohn Violin Concerto. After all, I'm guessing that many of you watching this video have heard it before. In fact, a lot of you have probably heard the Victoria Symphony perform it. We've performed it at least 17 times in our history. I'll focus on a few things that maybe you know already, but maybe you don't. For starters, if you're going to talk about this piece, you should at least show a picture of this guy alongside Mendelssohn. That image of Mendelssohn on the left, by the way, is by Hadi Karimi. I've been sharing a bunch of his digital reconstructions of images of composers. That fellow on the right is the violinist Ferdinand David, the man for whom this concerto was written. Now, usually the reputation of the composer ends up eclipsing the performer for whom a work was written. So I want to tell you a little bit about David. First of all, he had a big role in the creation of this work. David was close to Mendelssohn, they were friends. He was the concertmaster of the orchestra that Mendelssohn led for much of his career, and that was the Gewandhaus Orchestra in Leipzig. That orchestra still exists today, by the way. It's one of the oldest orchestras in the world that was formed for public concerts. Now, since Mendelssohn wasn't a violinist, he relied very heavily on David as a collaborator to determine what worked for the instrument and what didn't. Now, prior to this, most people who wrote concerti for the violin actually played the instrument, and Beethoven was an exception. In fact, David himself was also a trained composer and left us a number of works. David, like Mendelssohn, was born into a Jewish family. In fact, he was born in the same house as Mendelssohn. Now, I don't know why this is. Maybe their families rented alongside each other, who knows. Both men had sisters who became professional musicians as well. Very unusual in any era. David's sister Louise became a pianist, and Mendelssohn's sister Fanny became both a pianist and a composer. So there's a lot in common between these two. David is also famous in my rather niche world of trombone and trombone-related lore. He was one of the only 19th century composers to write a concerto for the trombone. So David premiered the Mendelssohn Violin Concerto in 1845, only 2 years before Mendelssohn himself died tragically at the age of only 38 after a series of strokes. David and the composer Robert Schumann were among the pallbearers at Mendelssohn's funeral, along with one of Mendelssohn's teachers, Ignaz Moscheles. I'm going to mention him later. Now, one of the things I usually ask audiences to do when I'm presenting a familiar work like this is to imagine what it must have been like to hear this work for the first time. So what would maybe have taken audiences of the day by surprise? Well, first of all, in most of the concertos written prior to this, the orchestra would have the first word. They would often present all of the big themes in a long introduction, and then the soloist would take them up. You heard that in the Mozart concerti that we performed earlier this season. Not so with Mendelssohn. He leaps in right away, and the violin starts with the main theme. And this theme, Mendelssohn wrote something very interesting to David about it, that he wanted to write him a violin concerto. He said that this theme was running through his head and gave him no peace, which is an interesting way of looking at this. Another feature of this concerto is that at times the soloist accompanies the orchestra. The soloist will play a figure underneath the instruments in the orchestra that's playing one of the themes. Another feature is that this piece is meant to be performed without breaks in between movements. That would have been unusual for sure, and I'm sure someone clapped after the first movement when this was first played. The cadenzas, or the cadenza especially, that part of the concerto where the soloist plays alone without the orchestra, and it's usually a free elaboration on the themes of the piece. These were actually composed by Mendelssohn, and this is a fairly new innovation. In Mozart's day and prior to that, soloists would write or improvise their own cadenzas, something that is a bit of a lost art now. Now we have Mendelssohn's actual composer manuscript for this, and I want to show it to you. He actually had pretty neat handwriting, so I'm just going to play you a little bit of the opening of the first movement, and I'll show you Mendelssohn's handwriting over top of this. And you've probably heard this before, so what I did to find something unusual, I found a recording of someone practicing this piece alone. I thought it would be interesting to just hear the melody all by itself. Now remember, this is the melody that Mendelssohn said gave him no peace. So have a listen to this. It's interesting to hear someone practicing this over top of that. You can imagine what violinists that have to play this on major auditions in their career have to go through. So you can sort of understand, for them anyway, that the whole no peace business that Mendelssohn was talking about. But musically, you can hear the restlessness in, well, for a start, in those fast passages at the end of the clip. But you can also hear it in the very, very beginning. I'm going to put an image of just the very first few bars back here. And you can see the note, well, okay, for a start, when you're talking about a minor key, the notes that distinguish a minor key from a major one in the scale are the third note and the sixth note, and I'll demonstrate. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. That's a major scale. A minor, the third and the sixth notes are different. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Now Mendelssohn makes a really, really great use of that sixth scale degree. And that little passage right near the end of this phrase. That C there really sticks out. He really emphasizes that really well. He also uses that forbidden interval, and I mentioned that a lot in these talks, and that's the tritone, or the diminished fifth, and it's right at the end of this passage. Da 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 da. That's the tritone right there. Now that interval wasn't quite so forbidden in Mendelssohn's day, but it still gives an audience a bit of an unsettled feeling. Like another composer might have avoided that D sharp and written an F sharp instead. Da 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 da. I'm really glad Mendelssohn didn't do that. I'm glad he wrote the D sharp. It gives it that feeling of restlessness. So this was Mendelssohn's last big scale orchestral piece, and as I said, it's really fitting that we're ending our season with a brilliant performance, I'm sure, of this by our own concertmaster. So on to Louise Farrenc, and this seems to be the only portrait we have of her. She was born Jean-Louise Dumont in Paris in 1804, and she was descended from a long line of professional artists, and I mean visual artists, including a number of women painters. Her father and her brother were both famous sculptors. Now, to put her on a program with Felix Mendelssohn is really quite interesting. She was 5 years older than Mendelssohn, and I was really curious. I tried in my research to find some evidence that she might have actually met Mendelssohn and his sister Fanny, who was a composer as well. I kind of want to believe that women in the arts in those days had at least some kind of a network to support each other. I couldn't find any evidence that they ever met. Except possibly Farrenc did do concert tours as a pianist, and I don't know where she went, but I also know that she studied, perhaps only briefly, with Ignaz Moscheles, and you'll remember I just mentioned him as one of Mendelssohn's teachers and one of the pallbearers at his funeral. So I'd like to think that Farrenc and Mendelssohn might have met. They might have actually, well, I'm sure they knew each other's music because Schumann reviewed works of Farrenc in the famous periodical that he published, and they would have, I'm sure they would have known each other's music. Now, women have been writing music, and women have indeed been making art since the beginning. It's a real shame that most of the works that end up as standard repertoire exclude them. Now, I'm ashamed to admit this myself. Now, I'm supposed to be an expert in this sort of stuff, and I was thinking the other day, I could not name a single opera written by a woman. Can you? I looked up operas by women. The first thing I learned was that the first opera performed outside of Italy was written by a woman named Francesca Caccini. Why isn't this general musical knowledge? Especially to someone like me who has 3 rather expensive pieces of paper on his studio wall. Anyway, the barriers to women becoming composers in the 19th century were considerable. So it helped to have a very supportive spouse. And Louise Dumont married such a man, a flutist named Aristide Farrenc. He not only toured with her, he established a publishing company that championed her work, especially her piano music. And it's her piano and her chamber music that she is most remembered for, and she was a very gifted pianist. Now, despite winning many awards and becoming a full professor of piano at the Paris Conservatory, she was, yep, you guessed it, paid less than her male colleagues for the better part of a decade, the better part of her career, in fact. Finally, with the acclaim of her Nonette, a chamber music piece she wrote, which included in its premiere the famous violinist Joseph Joachim. Now, he was the violinist for whom Brahms wrote his famous concerto. Only then did Farrenc achieve pay parity at the Conservatoire with her male counterparts. Farrenc's only child was a daughter, Victorine, who also became a celebrated pianist. Unfortunately, her life was tragically cut short. She died before her 33rd birthday. So it's a shame because it would have been wonderful to see what that legacy would have blossomed into. Farrenc didn't leave us a lot of orchestral music. We're performing one of 2 concert overtures that she wrote. She also wrote 3 symphonies. Now, I thought rather than spoiling the surprise of hearing the overture for the first time, I'd play you a short excerpt from one of her symphonies. This is a little bit of the scherzo from her 3rd symphony. So there's a composer deserving of wider recognition. Maybe for the rest of the time that we're locked indoors during this pandemic, we should explore the art made by the gender that comprises half the world's population. I think that would be a worthy pursuit. I'm certainly going to look up more works by this composer especially. Now, before I go, since this is the last concert before the summer, and we'll be back in the summer to offer more, just stay tuned, I just want to thank all of you for tuning into these concerts and my silly videos and making donations to help support us. This has been the most difficult year to earn a living as a musician, and the community support behind us is quite overwhelming. The number of people who have reached out to me personally just to see how I'm doing, that's been wonderful. I know that videos are not a substitute for sharing the same space with us, but I really hope you'll take advantage of these videos. They are free, after all, while they're available. Listen to some of these lesser-known works multiple times. Have a good look at us close up. You're seeing us in a way that you can't see us, even with the best concert hall seat. And that's a fact that's made me somewhat self-conscious when I go to work these days. And tell your friends, not just here in Victoria, but around the world. I'm going to make a challenge to you once we are allowed to have audiences again. Think about a friend who may not have ever heard us before and invite them along. I have data that proves that that is our most effective marketing. People regularly go to concerts because someone invited them and it stuck. So thank you for listening. Do keep in touch, and I'm going to see you all very soon.